Tony's just...
Over to you now,
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ewan McKeown. I'm the Senior Curator of Contemporary Design and Architecture at the NGV. Welcome to this evening at Walsh Street to launch After the Australian Ugliness. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the land of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and through them to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as we're filming tonight, I'd also like to acknowledge that for the people who watch this later, that all design and architecture that takes place in Australia takes place on Indigenous land. So welcome to Walsh Street. On behalf of the NGV and the Robin Boyd Foundation, I would like to welcome you here to the Boyd House 2. Boyd designed this house in 1958 and moved in with his family in 1959. A year later, in 1960, The Australian Ugliness was published. So it's likely that Robin Boyd sat reading draft proofs of the book under this very ceiling or hanging out in the garden, which is a nice thing to reflect on as we gather here to discuss how that book's ideas stack up 60 years later. So I'm just going to introduce the book. The idea for a book re-examining Robin Boyd's The Australian Ugliness on its 60th anniversary year first came about following a conversation between Naomi Stead, Tom Lee and Joy Violino. I think, Joy, I spotted you here briefly. I'm glad you're here, regarding the upcoming anniversary of the original book. So by the end of 2019, most of the authors were commissioned and had begun writing their submissions, and by March 2020, essays were being written. But we all know what happened next. To the credit of the editorial committee and the dedicated NGV Publications team, production pressed on through 2020. I know I was doing Zooms from the cubby house in the garden with a beanie, and we're delighted with this finished publication and the depth of ideas presented here from our many authors. Thank you again. Now you're going to have to bear with me because there's quite a few thank yous, so have a drink. Before we start tonight's panel, there are a few people I would like to acknowledge. First of all, the Robin Boyd Foundation. I would like to thank the Foundation for hosting us this evening. On behalf of the NGV, I would also like to thank the Foundation for their support of the book from the very beginning and acknowledge the board members in attendance, Tony Isaacson, Sophie Gannon, Philip Goad and Joy Violino, and myself apparently now as well. Oh, and me, I said in my notes. Contributors. I would like to thank the many contributors to the book, particularly those in attendance this evening. Thank you to Vanessa Berry, to Anne Carew, Harriet Edquist, Philip Goad, Stephanie Guest, Tom Lee, Eugenia Lim, Peter McNeil, Elizabeth Mossop, Naomi Stead, Liz Taser, Megan Patty and Michael Ryan. I would particularly like to acknowledge Oslo Davis and David Wedelton. Oslo drew a wonderful series of illustrations for the book, riffing on Boyd's original line drawings for The Australian Ugliness, and David shot the beautifully ugly series of Melbourne photographs you see dividing the essays. I wish also to acknowledge Mary Featherston AM, a close friend of Boyd's and an important custodian of one of his finest houses, who kindly wrote a message for us as well. Monash and UTS. In a first for the NGV, we teamed up with the Monash University and the University of Technology Sydney to produce After the Australian Ugliness. These two partnerships have been incredibly rewarding, and the contributions of both institutions have been invaluable. From Monash, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Shane Murray, Mel Dodd, Head of Architecture, Professor Melissa Miles, Associate Dean Research, and Dr. Anthea Bangara, Senior Manager Research and Graduate Research. From UTS, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Elizabeth Mossop, Dean of Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building, and Kate Sweetapple, Head of School of Design. And thank you so much for coming to be with us tonight. Joining Megan Patty, the Head of Publications, and myself on the editorial panel of the book was Naomi Stead, Professor of Architecture in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash, and Tom Lee, Senior Lecturer of Design Studies at the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building at the University of Technology. Both Naomi and Tom will join the panel, of course. You can see them sitting in front of you. Which is very good, but I'm glad I'm being thorough. I would also like to acknowledge that After the Australian Ugliness is co-editioned with Thames and Hudson, who have been incredibly supportive of this and other recent NGV publications. We hope to continue this partnership into the future. I'd also like to thank Kirsten Abbott, publisher at Thames and Hudson, and Danielle Watts, Asia Pacific Regional Manager of Thames and Hudson, who are both in attendance this evening, apparently. I also acknowledge members of the NGV Publications team who worked on the title, in particular Michael Ryan, who is here, Managing Project Editor, and Dirk Hiscock, who did an amazing job as our Senior Graphic Designer. So tonight's event is part of the Melbourne Art Book Fair and Melbourne Design Week. And I won't go into too much detail, but the program is rolling. It's very exciting. Over 300 exhibitions, talks, films, tours and workshops taking place across Victoria and online. It's the biggest program we've developed so far, and the theme for 2021 is Design the World You Want. So while we have no way of knowing what Boyd would make of the book we have created after the Australian Ugliness, I'm sure he would be pleased to know that the ideas he laid out in his book, The Australian Ugliness, and his many other books are still generating heated debate, fostering new conversations and new ideas, such as those in the essays in this book. Thank you all very much for attending. And now I would like to end my little bit and hand over to Naomi Stead, Professor of Architecture at Monash, to moderate the panel.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Thank you, Ewan, and thank you all for coming for this very exciting celebratory moment. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Boyd, only a tiny bit, because I suspect there's quite a lot of knowledge already in this room, and a tiny bit of background on the original Australian Ugliness, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. As you know, it's hard to overstate just how much Boyd was in the public consciousness in the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s. He was on TV, he was on the radio, he was published in The Age just about every weekend. And of course, thousands of Australians purchased plans for the legendary small home service. It's also important to acknowledge Boyd's place in Australia's most famous creative dynasty. The NGV collection includes more than 350 works by members of the Boyd family, and the name is synonymous with the evolution of modern art in Australia, especially in Melbourne. Robin, as we know, came from a long and celebrated line of painters, potters, sculptors and writers. He added architecture to the dynasty. But while we all know Robin Boyd was a great architect, what this new publication sets out to do is highlight how brilliant he also was as a writer, and as a provocateur, and as a great commentator, bringing architectural knowledge to a broad public audience, as one of Australia's first great architecture and design educators. It's this aspect of his multifaceted career that really brings us here today. So The Australian Ugliness, as you know, was first published in 1960, and apart from a brief lull in the 1990s and 2000s, has been in continuous print ever since. On the 50th anniversary of its publication back in 2010, Text Publishing republished a new edition with a new foreword by Christos Tsourkos and a new afterword written by John Denton, Geoffrey London and Philip Goad. Here we are 10 years later, with an even more in-depth and broad-ranging discussion of its ongoing significance. Many of the ideas that the Australian Ugliness explored, such as the national obsession with skin and surface, with veneering, what Boyd called cloak and camouflage, are still highly relevant today, arguably. But others, perhaps not so much. Some of Boyd's aesthetic obsessions, especially his hatred for garden gnomes and overhead telegraph wires, might seem trivial today in light of the existential threats we face, such as climate and biodiversity catastrophe, pandemic, and the fallout from centuries of entrenched racism and sexism. Still, Boyd was a progressive who was in many ways ahead of his time, and some aspects of his book were in fact prescient, which is why it has endured to still be a bestseller today. So it is these enduring complexities that the 19 highly varied essays in After the Australian Ugliness, I should be brandishing it, but it is quite a large book, so just imagine it's over there, and which we are here to celebrate and discuss today. So with this event, our hope is to welcome the book, to celebrate, to pique your interest in it, to discuss some of the issues that it raises, to celebrate the authors, and ultimately to launch it. I'm not trying to sell it to you because I believe those of you who have not already received a copy will be receiving a copy, but it would make a wonderful Easter gift for your friends and family. So in order to do that, we have a wonderful panel of writers, each of whom has an essay in the book, and it is my particular pleasure to welcome our visitors from Sydney, Tom Lee and Vanessa Berry, visitors from another city. It's quite exciting. So first I will briefly introduce the panellists, and we'll take it from there. I'll go from the end. Professor Philip Goad is an internationally recognised authority on modern Australian architecture, and in particular the life and work of Robin Boyd. He is the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor and Chair of Architecture at the University of Melbourne and a board member of the Robin Boyd Foundation. Dr. Vanessa Berry is an academic, writer, artist and author of Mirror Sydney, an Atlas of Reflections, a collection of essays and maps investigating the city's marginal places and undercurrents. This is one of her books. She has other books also. Her visual arts work has been widely exhibited, including at Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art and the National Gallery. She is a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Sydney. Eugenia Lim is a writer and artist who works across video, performance and installation. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including at the Tate Modern, Loop Barcelona, the Museum of Contemporary Art and ACCA. She has been artist in residence with the Experimental Television Centre in New York and the Robin Boyd Foundation. Since 2019, she has been co-director of the 26-year-old artistic company Aphids. She teaches at both RMIT and the VCA. Finally, Dr. Thomas Lee is an academic, novelist and essayist with a particular interest in, quote, the way feelings and sensations attach to and are expressed in objects, images and places. His 2018 novel, Coach Fitz, won the Sydney Morning Herald's Best Young Australian Novelist Award. He's a senior lecturer in design studies at the University of Technology, Sydney. Please welcome our panellists. The panellists and I have agreed that each of them will here briefly introduce their own chapter. I'm assuming you haven't read it cover to cover yet. In connection and comparison with another chapter of their own choice from the book, looking for alignments and distinctions between the two chapters and discussing them both. So shortly I will ask that of each of our panellists, but before that, let's start with a question for everybody. When you agreed to write something for the book, and when you turned or returned to Boyd's original text with a reconsidering eye, what was one thing that struck you, that interested or surprised you, or that you found important in Boyd's text now? Who wants to go first?
On a game show. I mean, I think definitely I was so surprised at the amount of times that the telegraph poles and wires overhead came to pass. I couldn't kind of get past it, but that was one pithy thing. And then I guess the other was that I guess there is a real politic to the book that would have been quite, I guess, I don't know, I guess something quite out of the blue perhaps for the profession back at the time, and perhaps even now it's still quite rare to read or kind of hear of an architect who is engaging with the politics of the time. So I guess I felt that still kind of resonated for me, but I think the vast the decades and the very different world that you touched on in your intro that we find ourselves in now, I think there's a lot that can kind of be unpacked.
Who would like to go next?
Do you want me to go? I'll go next.
Yes.
Look, I know the book quite well. It was very nice to be asked to re-look at it. And I guess one of the strongest impressions that I always get from the Australian Ugliness is the passion with which he's speaking about the suburbs. And it struck me, why isn't anyone doing this today about our suburbs? I mean, Australia's experiencing extraordinary urbanisation, probably as voracious as it was back in the 50s. And I guess the striking thing about the Australian Ugliness is that we don't have a similar figure like Boyd saying it as it is, which I think was his strength. And so I think for me to come back to it and look at it in that light and say, goodness, this is someone very brave, being very frank, and possibly from a privileged position, but nevertheless, we need that sort of voice to talk about our own cities today.
Vanessa, you want to go next?
Yeah, I was struck by or I paid a lot of attention to the quality of attention that Robin Boyd brings to the urban environment. So when you read The Australian Ugliness, of course, his descriptions of the details of the urban environment are so striking and often quite funny and a real delight of the book. But I was thinking about that in terms of what does that mean about attention? Like when we are in the urban environment, how can we bring that sort of critical attention as well as acute attention to our surroundings? So I was thinking about that as a way of picking up something from the book which I might take into my essay. And I know this is two things, but I had a quote that I particularly loved that, it's such a rich and complex text that I think every time you read it, new things are going to be jumping out at you, which is one of the reasons why it's been a book that has endured and has so many lives. But the quote is about buildings, and he describes buildings as the most complex and pervasive objects in our lives. I just love that. I think it's a really beautiful quote. And of course, there's a lot of architects here, so probably not something which is unusual or in the background of your thinking. But just as a quote to think about, the complexity and the pervasiveness and how important it is to pay attention, that kind of close attention I mentioned.
Tom?
I was really struck by how he analysed the world, at least towards the first half of the book. Colour was such a huge part of the way that he described Australia, both in kind of critical and kind of laudatory senses. And that just really stood out to me. I had read it a number of times before, but I'd noticed that colour was really a really important part of the way he evoked the Australian atmosphere. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, I think, how prescient some of the comments remain regarding the sort of superficial censoriousness of Australian politicians in particular, but, Australian culture. But then underneath, it's just that censoriousness covers up and kind of enables, violence, bad behaviour as well. And I think that contradiction in the Australian character he really managed to capture quite well. Yeah.
Well, Tom, maybe we'll continue with you then, because in your own essay, in fact, you pick up quite distinctly on the question of colour, and particularly around decor, and particularly the living room. So your essay is a very nuanced account of how living spaces gather personal memory and family history over time, which seem to become lodged or captured in decor and furnishings, and how this sometimes contrasts with Boyd's somewhat caricatured account of featureless living rooms, where he's pretty withering, I have to say, towards housewives, quote unquote, and their decor. So I'd like to hear more about that. And you've chosen to pair your own essay with Liz Taylor's essay about the history of urban planning in Australia, and I'm intrigued about this choice. Tell us more.
Well, I was hoping I'd make an intriguing choice. That was the first thing. How do I do that? So I think, I haven't met Liz before either. Nice to meet you.
This is the one with the baby, everyone.
I think in part it's the contrast. So the contrast, and then there's maybe subtle connections. So as Naomi said, my essay focuses on, it's quite a personal essay that uses a lot of episodic memory to describe an Australian 1950s interior over 3 generations, members of my family and houses that I've lived in or my parents and grandparents have lived in. So it's a very, a personal reflective essay about intimate spaces. And Liz's, on the other hand, is there's an element of the personal in it, of course, but it's quite impersonal and not using reflections from her own life as much. And also it's urban planning, so we're dealing with things that are a large scale and things that rules and regulations, things that often aren't necessarily considered to be the work of creative or aesthetically aware individuals. And I thought it was a really pertinent provocation in Liz's chapter to talk about how there is a huge amount of creativity that goes into making something that is at once adaptable for specific purposes, but also prevents certain things happening as well. You know, provides rules and restrictions and regulations. So I think there's obviously a lot of creativity that goes into it's an aesthetic art as much as anything else, balancing those two things when it comes to planning, and that was something that I found very interesting. I also liked, I think, drew out some of the key ideas in Boyd's book and updated them and exemplified them quite neatly. So begins with an account of power lines and talking about the role, the prominence that, you know, they're very prominent in both the imagery associated with the Australian ugliness and in the book. But I think ultimately, as you point out in your chapter, Liz, that they're kind of conspicuous but relatively inconsequential things in terms of if you're going to get really, you know, pissed off about something, then power lines in the environment are far less annoying than something like getting rid of trees in a suburb or the energy and impact of cars in an urban environment. And I really appreciated that sentiment in Liz's essay, where it's sometimes quite hard to account for the forces and energies that define a city that aren't necessarily conspicuously visual, and I think that the power lines are a little bit of a red herring in terms of getting really annoyed by something in the urban environment when you know, suburbs, you know, cutting down a tree, or, you know, not having trees in a landscape is, you know, I think that's a really serious problem for all kinds of reasons, and it's sort of tempted to say that this kind of something, we don't say universal anymore, it's sort of universal-ish about getting rid of trees being bad. And I think the same with cars as well, which is another focus of the chapter. Like, you can't overstate the catastrophic pervasiveness of cars in the urban environment. And it's like the visual impact is one thing, but it's the force and the energy and the violence and the deaths, and that is a really important thing as well, like the presence of cars. And so I thought the way that you analysed the relationship between conspicuous but inconsequential things and then things that are less conspicuous but very important and very consequential was something that appealed to me. And I think there's a sort of a connection perhaps between that and what I was attempting to do in my chapter, where I wanted to show how important memory was when it comes to inhabiting and living in spaces. And memory is something that's very hard to visualise. It's inconspicuous but very important. And I think how to find a way to introduce memory and the feelings associated with it into representations of space is a very challenging thing to do. And so, yeah, I think there's a thematic connection there between the inconspicuousness but importance of memory and some of the things that you traced over in your chapter, Liz, with regard to the powerful but inconspicuous forces that define the urban landscape, rules or cars or energy. Yeah.
Photography also has an important role in your own essay, Tom, where you have these photographs of yourself and a sibling, I believe, as young blonde moppets in one of these interiors. And you know, the family photograph has a particular resonance and power. Also, I want to ask you about housewives, because I think your essay particularly seems to focus on the influence of women in your life. But we're going to hold that question and instead move to Eugenia, so housewives and family photographs. Eugenia, your essay in the book reflects on your own art practice, and specifically your 2018 installation and multi-channel video work, The Australian Ugliness, which addresses questions of national and cultural identity and both the spatial politics and, quote, willful blind spots of Australian architecture. You've chosen to also consider Alison Page's essay, which opens the book with the question of whether, quote, whether Robin Boyd spent much or any time with blackfellas, end quote. Can you tell us a bit about your essay and Alison's and what chimes between them?
I'll attempt to. So I stole the title for my work from Robin Boyd completely. It's definitely, I like to do that. I often, there are amazing texts that are in our cultural memory that I like to kind of tap into and talk back to. So as Naomi said, my essay in the book kind of expands on, I guess, the making of this video work, which was a non-linear work that toured through different spaces in 35 different locations in Australia. And I guess my thesis for the work and for this essay maybe are that I'm interested in the idea of agency in architecture. I'm interested in the idea that if architecture is this universal visual art, this form which all of us have a connection to on a daily basis, why aren't more of us involved in its design or its making? And I guess as a woman who is a non-architect and second-generation Australian who's an artist, often, I feel quite, outside or divorced from this form that I spend a lot of my time in. And I guess the work that I made and this writing was about trying to maybe insert myself into this space and take up Boyd's idea that design is for everybody. It is something that if we have, a kind of connection to and greater literacy within, then it is something that we can call our own, that we can actually belong in. So I really resonated with Alison Page's essay, because she's writing from a First Nations perspective. And she's talking about how, there's been this 65,000-year culture and legacy of design and culture that is all of our histories. It's all of our culture. So even though there's been, great, recent history of violence and of colonisation, these things coexist in Australia. This is our identity. And I guess, my essay, while it's written from a very different perspective, I also really chime with that idea of coexistence, with this idea that, all these things are us. They're conflicting, they're contradictory, but there is no universalising force. And I guess that's probably what places, my work in vast difference with Boyd's, because, I'm writing from a very different time. But I really loved reading Alison's essay, and I felt that she was maybe more generous than I am with Boyd, because she finishes her essay talking about if she was, overlooking maybe even Botany Bay with Cook, she would want Boyd there with her in this kind of three-way dialogue about contemporary Australia. So I was like, wow, that's a very powerful and I think very generous kind of notion of, let's talk about this coexistence. Highly recommend Alison's essay.
Well, and also your own. I couldn't help but notice on the social medias during the week that you commented that in relation to this event, that when you reread your own essay, you were surprised to find how angry it was.
So angry. I mean, I was like, wow, it's real. I think it was interesting because I wrote the essay in deep lockdown, as we all did. And I remember just asking, please, I need more time. I'm like homeschooling, I can't do this. And so many times I felt like, I can't actually finish this essay. It was really quite
you were
hard.
angry with us. I thought you were angry with
Yeah, it was the editors. Damn you and your deadlines. I think that fed into the anger.
I'll delete my response then.
I think that I think everything was heightened in that moment because I was spending a lot of time in architecture. I couldn't leave architecture. I was like living at home in this space. And I think, all of those, I don't know, the ideas, the provocations that Boyd brings up in the book, I was thinking a lot about, and I was reflecting back on my video work as well, and that before time of when we had freedom of movement. And I think there definitely is an anger and a politic. I think I'm kind of taking Boyd's tone and his sort of, his challenges and trying to kind of, have a dialogue and speak back to them and offer perhaps new ones as well. Anger can be productive.
Totally, totally agree. Vanessa, your essay is a really wonderful embodied account of what we might call your own urban fieldwork or detective work in Sydney, exploring the zones of Sydney that Boyd defined in his chapter Pioneers and Arborophobes. as they are in the present day. So you've chosen to also reflect on the chapter by Guest Riggs, which forms a kind of centrepiece for the new book. So I'm interested in the correspondences you see between these two.
Well, maybe a good place to start is just to describe the chapter for those who haven't read it. So it's written in, two writers have written it in collaboration, and it's a conversation between them. And I think conceptually it does set up a good, or draws attention to that dynamic in the book, because every single chapter is in conversation with the Australian ugliness, with Robin Boyd. So that aspect of it I found very important in my reading of the book. It was also a shift in perhaps tone and style from a lot of the chapters, it being a conversation and about the struggle to read the book. So it wasn't, it was engaging very broadly with the concepts of the book. So, I mean, ugliness is such a provocative thing for everyone. Like we have strong opinions about what we might find ugly. I was quite interested in another one of the chapters that I think it was Megan's that mentioned that the Australian ugliness was the title chosen by the publisher, which I thought was an interesting point, because it is such a powerful and resonant title. Anyway, I won't get too distracted and ramble.
What was the other alternative title? Sorry to distract
I think
further.
it was
yeah.
The Featurist.
That's right.
And that was a very interesting point for me, because I think that notion of ugliness it reaches out to you from the book. Many years before I read it, I would see it in bookstores, and it always had great covers. And I'd see it and I think, oh, the Australian ugliness. Yeah, I know. I felt like I knew it. Whatever my version of the Australian ugliness was, and I think it's such a provocative title. But yeah, so the Guest Riggs chapter is very much about the present. So the present moment of attempting to read this book with all of the distractions of everyday life, with world events, so pandemic, and before that the bushfires of 2019, 2020. And so it folds in a whole lot of everyday life, present moment experience. And right at the beginning, when they're struggling to read this book, one of them says, is this book relevant? You know, does it seem urgent? And they sort of answer that question, I think, in the chapter, in suggesting that we bring the present and we bring the nowness to the book in our reading of it. So as we read it, we activate elements of it. And we've already spoken about how some things have sort of fallen away in importance. As I mentioned at the start, something about quality of attention and Robin Boyd's quality of attention, and certainly in the Guest Riggs chapter is this very close attention to everyday life and its details. But attention is all well and good, but what do you do with it? So there's this acute attention, but how is it activated, and how can it activate a political consciousness or a critical consciousness? And I think that's very much in evidence in the Australian ugliness. So yes, there's a lot of very acute observation, but it's activated and it's contextualised within these broader political points. And I think a lot of the chapters in After the Australian Ugliness do that too. Like they focus in on particular details with these broader political contexts behind them. The chapter that I wrote was revisiting the three zones of Sydney that Boyd determined. So the Villawood zone, the Tom Ugly zone, and the North Shore Executive zone. And I decided to go to these places to look around and see how what was there now matched up to how he wrote about them in the Australian Ugliness. And really, it kind of stood up as being fairly similar to how he described these places. But so in my writing, in my blog and book Mirror Sydney, I use the energy of the present moment and the present moment observation to activate broader stories about these places. And so I went to all these places, and I always find when I go to somewhere and I think, oh, I'm going to write about wherever, and I think, what will I write? And I go there and it's just so rich, like things the physicality of the place, the atmosphere of the place suggests so much. So, for example, when I went to Villawood, it might be a name familiar to you from knowing about the Villawood Detention Centre, which is right in the middle of the suburb, and I mean, you absolutely can't miss it. It has many layers of razor wire around it, that kind of carceral atmosphere. But right next to it, there was a new housing development that had just been built. And so that was very stark, no trees, these white box houses. And speaking of boxes, yeah, big boxes of appliances kind of stacked up there for rubbish, and people have just moved in and unboxing their appliances. And then, yeah, these razor wire fences, and then the detention centre, and stray cats running around, no people. So, yeah, in these kinds of scenes, all I needed to do was just kind of stand there and look at it, and it was like the chapter was writing itself as I was standing there. But, yeah, and so, I mean, I could keep talking about, I might say one more thing. So, yes, I brought my quality of attention to this place, and I felt like I'd brought Robin Boyd's as well, because I'd been thinking about that in my reading. So we were there together, and I noticed quite a few chapters had this idea of Boyd being with the writer in some way. So whether kind of there by the writer's side, having an opinion about a kitsch garden or a garden gnome or something like that, or more broadly, Boyd's presence was very strong.
Indeed. The idea of what would Boyd think is, of course, accompanying us all throughout our everyday lives. You mentioned that there were no trees in the new housing development in Villawood. So would you say that arborophobia, Boyd's arborophobia, was certainly alive and well in that context?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there might have been little ones that were, the idea being they grow to be magnificent, but it was very stark. It was a bright, sunny day. The light was bouncing off these white houses that looked like sheets of A4 paper. Yeah, it was all very glaring.
You also, if we have time, we should come back to Sylvania Waters, which you also explored, which also writes itself pretty much. But before we come back to that, Philip, your essay is a really fascinating account of Boyd's life and work in the years leading up to the publication of The Australian Ugliness, including his travels to the US. And I'm very interested to hear about your role in unearthing some of Boyd's own photographs from that visit, never before published, but available in this book, and discussed in Michael Ryan's essay in the book. There's also a clear correspondence between your own essay and the one by Nancy Levinson, written from the perspective of an American who had never read the book before, but read it for the first time and reflected on its significance. So tell us more.
Sure. So my essay was really to try and help the reader contextualise when Robin had written this book. And he'd written it after spending a whole year away in the United States. He'd been a visiting Bemis professor at MIT, a pretty light teaching load and a lot of travel, and a lot of meeting with architects, and becoming a great friend of Walter Gropius, and seeing some of his idols' work, like the work of Eero Saarinen. He went to General Motors in Detroit, the Technical Centre. He went to Eero Saarinen's office in Bloomfield Hills in Michigan. And the book is written directly after he comes back. So he's immersed himself in contemporary American culture. He's loved driving American cars and automatics and things like that. When he's been in Los Angeles, he's seen Capitol Records. He stayed at the Beverly Hilton, and he's lived the whole sort of American dream. And I think he has been at once absolutely entranced by it, and at other times absolutely appalled by it. And coming home, and that's when the book opens, when The Australian Ugliness opens. It opens with him looking out the aircraft window, coming home. And as Tom said, it's that first description is all about colour. And so my essay contextualises how did Boyd come to write the book, And then I describe Boyd's three main catchphrases: that featureism, austerica, the cheapened version of America we do in Australia really well, and the third one is arborophobia, and that hatred of trees. And they're the really easy takeaways from the book. But the next section of the book is about beauty. And so you can see why the publisher goes, no, let's call this the Australian ugliness, because for Robin, I think this question of beauty was really difficult, and it was a key issue at the end of the 50s in terms of his role as an architect and how do you define it. And when he came back to Australia and saw all these, what he thought was terribly ugly, it was, well, that's the popular notions of beauty don't coincide with his notions of beauty. So a lot of the writing he was doing in the States was about pleasingness, this pursuit of beauty. And my essay tries to make sense of that and tries to make sense of Robin's readings to try and get at what the notion of beauty was. And then in the second half of the essay, I look at, well, what's hanging on from the Australian ugliness? And a lot of the ideas about cloak and camouflage we now celebrate. All of Australian building culture is fundamentally based on the veneer. That's how our builders build. It's cheap and nasty, but that's how we do it. And the whole notion of austerica, we just do it in a different way. We may not copy America visually, but we copy it still in all sorts of ways, in terms of popular culture, in terms of sub-politics. It's very American. But arborophobia, I think, is one of the key elements which still Australians cannot cope with. And it's particularly, I think, in terms of Australian native plants and trees. And I think there's a real issue there, which we still haven't come to terms with. And a lot of the other essayists talk about this ugliness of Australia and not really being able to accept our Indigenous past, our colonial past, and so on. And when I read then Nancy Levinson's essay, it's a fantastic one because it's an American coming to Boyd cold. I come with an enormous lot of baggage, so, but it was great reading Nancy's, because you realise too that Robin Boyd was a contemporary of, if you like, an environmental push generally globally, but particularly in America, because the Australian ugliness predates Peter Blake's book, God's Own Junkyard. It predates Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It does so many things, and so many of the ecological, environmental, if you like, morality is still relevant. And he's there thinking, as Belgian writers were also thinking at the same time. They called, one author, Renata Bram, called Belgium the ugliest country in the world. But his book comes a bit later. So Nancy Levinson's essay is really good because she talks about the 60s and talks about how, in many respects, Robin was writing at the height of when America was at its peak, its zenith, and the 60s was when it all changed. And so the book, in many respects, can be read as a sort of hinge point of moving from the 50s into the 60s. The photographs, can I mention, were held by the family when Amy's here, and we'd not really ever had a look at them closely before with the foundation. So we had a look at them, and Robin, I'd have to, can I be blunt? He was an okay photographer. So not all of them were great, but the ones that we picked out, and then Michael Ryan was able to identify, and he was able to write very eloquently about. We realised that Robin was he photographed his architectural heroes. So there's an image of General Motors Technical Centre, but there are a lot of street scenes of African Americans, of ordinary streetscapes, which are really evocative. and they also show a human interest in many respects, a human side of his interest in American culture, which doesn't come through in the book at all, really. But the images that you see in after the Australian Ugliness really give you an insight to another story that he could have told. And Boyd himself, I think, throughout his writing, always hinted at the problem of race, and sometimes dealing with it well and sometimes not. The Walls Around Us is not a good example, but I think he was aware of it from his student days. He talked about Jim Crow culture in Queensland, in the Victorian modern, and that's 1947. So, but the photographs are fascinating because there are a lot of slides, and they show two sides of America. And finally, can I just finish? I wrote the essay when I was in America. I was there for a year and just lived a few streets away from Fernald Drive, where Robin had lived when he was at MIT. And the essay, there's an afterword where I thought, if I'd been Robin and I was looking what was happening in America, I think I'd prefer to be in Australia. You know, everything was sort of in crisis in America when I was there. Yeah. Dysfunctional politics, dysfunctional response to the pandemic, dysfunctional response architecturally in so many respects as well. And I just got the feeling that Robin had seen it at its peak and was able to be critical of it. If I'd been asked to do the same thing, it would have been a different book entirely.
And interestingly, Nancy comes to somewhat of a similar conclusion, doesn't she? That she sees American greatness, if I may use that word, reflected as a past artefact, not necessarily as a moment of the present.
That's right. Yeah. So, but I highly commend Nancy's essay to you.
I should also say that Elizabeth Mossop has an essay in the book which is all about arborophobia, and Elizabeth is here. There may be questions in the room. Does anybody have a question for our panellists? We have some time for Q&A, if anyone would like to. Yes?
It was mentioned earlier that Robin Boyd was very much a public figure. He was on the radio, on television, seemingly a part of the commentariat, which is fantastic. Is there a reason you think that we don't have architects in the public sphere today? You know, we don't have any architects on the radio or in the paper or on Dancing with the Stars or anything.
There's anyone in the Saturday paper that writes a bit, I hear.
Who wants to take that?
I think, yeah, it's hard. More about critics generally in terms of their space in the popular press. It's definitely been massively reduced, hasn't it? Like whether it's art or architecture. I mean, food criticism remains quite prominent, but even then, in terms of the printed press, it's reduced in space, and also often a lot of the food criticism out there is sort of bordering on advertising rather than genuinely interesting writing about food and aesthetics. So the critic is a dying figure in the Australian context, at least.
I think so. I think it's hard to bite the hand that feeds as well. Like, I think it's very difficult now because I mean, media landscape's so much more diffused, but there's, developers are involved in media. There's so many kind of, just tentacles of money that stretch out, and it's hard, I think, for an architect, I suppose, that since Boyd's time, architects are much less in the civic discourse in the way that maybe he was. I think that's a number of reasons, but I think that a lot of it has to do with money and about, I think, development and developers kind of becoming the true power mongers out there. So that's kind of
money didn't matter then?
Money definitely always has mattered, but I think when maybe back then there were, one or two papers. Now we have, still, I guess less. The big ones, there's less, but but there's social media, there's all sorts of different things out there. So I think, but I think there's definitely a space. I think that would be so great to have more architects actually talking about the value of what they do so that the public can understand that.
Yeah, I think architecture these days, on television at least, is marketed as entertainment. So although
Aspirational.
we enjoy grand designs and shows like it, I think architecture tends to be thought of as entertainment, whereas Robin was treading the line between architecture and politics and taste. And no one is actually talking about taste because I think we've changed position on taste. But I think Robin had a moment when taste was an issue that it was seen to be something that you might educate or enlighten the greater good, whereas I think no one would be so ambitious to do so these days. We wouldn't necessarily claim we had the right to educate someone in terms of taste.
Yes.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm very interested in this area, of course. That architectural critics, Robin and so on, have been architects. That's not the case with art critics and design critics.
No.
You're not an artist, you're not a designer, you're a critic, you're an historian. That's what we don't have. We don't have people outside the institution, the industry, actually criticising. And that's what we need. It's all internalised, and that's why no one can speak. So you just need a very healthy critical apparatus outside of architecture that can look at architecture in a very critical, because it needs it desperately.
Who pays their bills?
And it needed it in Robin's time. Robin's problem is he's an architect, so he'll always defend architecture.
Yeah.
Why?
So I think Elizabeth Farrelly in Sydney did a good job for a long time. She wasn't loved, but she spoke her mind and it got people talking. And I think we don't have, I think Harriet's right, it's bounded at the moment.
It's bounded by the industry, that's the problem.
Yeah.
But the question, Harriet, is who pays their bills?
Pays what bill?
The critics' bills.
Institutions like, you know, I've come out of an academic institution. I mean, they're the people, or I don't know who pays their bills, but my problem is that architectural criticism in Australia is being dominated by the industry. You can't have criticism that way. That's why no one will criticise anything. But if you're in an academic, say, situation, and you've got a salary and you're doing criticism, art history or something, then you do architectural history and you criticise.
Yeah.
But that's what our job is. But for some reason, unlike other art, I mean, what artist would assume that they're going to be protected from critics? Architects assume they're going to be protected from critics. It's ridiculous.
It's architectural commentary, isn't it, rather than architectural criticism?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But artists get up there, they're terribly brave. They put all their work up and they get shot down in ribbons. That's their career gone. And architects complain that, oh, well, it's my career. Well, here it is.
Yeah,
You'd
but
really
I
have
think
to
you have to
be
be
on the
careful
end.
because Robin didn't criticise his fellow
No,
professionals.
I'm not talking about Robin. I'm ranting about, you know, where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
And we are absolutely in the critical apparatus is just evaporating.
We probably have time for one more question. Joy.
First, I'd like to say congratulations. It's been a long journey and an exciting journey, and thank you for pushing such a great idea through. It's a fantastic book. Just to follow up on the questions about criticism, well, this book is a little bit like that, right? I mean, we are actually talking about architecture and design today. The book addresses that. It does have a reflection on the past, but, you know, to ignore the past is, you know, a bit of a folly when you criticize or trying to find commentary, as someone said. And I know that there are opportunities if you have a symposium, that was an idea early on, it would be really terrific to actually bring that as part and parcel of the discussion. How do we create that type of critical conjecture and commentary here in Australia? The NGV had that competition with Assemble this Melbourne Design Week. Perhaps there's more opportunity, as Harriet was saying, whether the universities do it or other entities that are involved in it. But I just want you to know that this is actually a commentary on architecture and design, and I think that we should discount that and maybe it's a start to something.
I had a question that I wanted to ask the panel. You'll have to answer quickly, though. Ewan, in his opening comments, said we can't know what Robin Boyd would have made of this new book, which is true. However, we can speculate. What do you think Robin Boyd would have made of this new book? Apart from loving it.
One of the things that really struck me about reading the book is just how energetic it is, and I think he would have found the energy of it. He would appreciate the energy of it and the enthusiasm that each of the writers has for bringing these ideas into the present and observing how the ideas have travelled. But just the energy of and excitement of engaging with these ideas now, I think he would have appreciated.
Yeah, I think he would have been very surprised and very pleased. And just to take one example, if he'd read Benjamin Law's essay in there, he would have gone, wow, Australia's changed, this is fantastic. Here's someone talking about real things in ordinary places, about places I wrote about, but he's doing it in a completely different way and completely critical and telling it as it is. I think he'd be surprised.
Yeah, likewise. I think he would have loved it. I think the fact that there are these diverse voices in the book, and I guess approaching his ideas from so many different perspectives, and he, I guess if I can presume anything, it is that he wanted his ideas and his discourse to be public and kind of debated and outside the profession, as Harriet was saying. So I think the fact that it is, it's not a kind of architectural tome. It's definitely approaching these ideas from a cultural and political and kind of environmental perspective as well. So I think he would have been chuffed.
Yeah, he'd have to be stoked, wouldn't he? Like, I think you would be. I'm just trying to put myself in his shoes, thinking if somebody did that about a book that I wrote, it'd be amazing.
Yeah.
But also, you've got to update it for the next generations. And I think so often I'm faced with a position tutoring classes, and you throw out a cultural reference point, and it just falls on deaf ears. Like, I thought I was on a winner with like Minority Report the other day to a student, and so surely they're going to know this. Like, I was like, is that long ago? So I think the book does fade into the past unless it's reinvigorated, and I think many of the chapters in this work really do reinvigorate it and bring it to life in the present. So I think, it's got to happen if it wants to continue to live on. Yeah.
Very good. That brings our proceedings to a close. Please feel free to continue to mingle. You're welcome to stay for a little longer to look around the house. If you would like a tour, just ask any of the Boyd Foundation volunteers. You will know them because they're wearing a Boyd Foundation badge. I personally would like to particularly thank the NGV, particularly Megan, Patty, Ewan McEwen and Michael Ryan. It's been an absolute pleasure to work on this book. It's been totally smooth and pleasurable, and that never ever happens. So, and all that remains is for me to formally announce the book launched. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Please join us for a drink.
Well done, Naomi.
Thank
Relax.
Nice work, team.
Thank you.
Always so much to say.
I know, it's short, 40 minutes. Especially in this age where everything is so surface level and quick and we don't notice anymore.
Sorry. Couldn't help myself.
Yeah, no, I could tell.